can you give a brief history of Islam? What does that look like?
Sure. So we have Islam started with the Prophet Muhammad. He was living in some city somewhere in Saudi Arabia, in what's now Saudi Arabia, and he would go to a cave and had visions, and his visions were according to the Quran, the teachings of the Quran and the traditions of Islam, the angel Gabriel would visit Muhammad and give him visions and talk to him and have these discourses with him. And so the Quran is kind of the recitation of what the angel Gabriel told the Prophet Muhammad, because Muhammad then took these teachings, went back to his hometown, and told his neighbors everything that he heard. And he'd go have another vision, come back to town, and tell his people. And so that's how what we understand the Quran to be. That's how that started. So Muhammad, with his followers, they were kicked out of their hometown, and so they went to another town. He and his followers went to another town, and I think they eventually they were harassed or they were discriminated against. So they eventually went back and formed kind of an army to take back his hometown that he was from. I think he was outnumbered pretty significantly. So when he won, it was amazing. It was really encouraging to a lot of his followers, and they thought, well, clearly this man has God's favor because we were outmatched and outmaneuvered, and we still won. So they went back so then in a sense he controlled two towns, and from there he went on more and more conquests and conquered more cities, more communities, and then grew into kind of a nation rather than just a following. And then that nation grew into what we call the caliphate, which is kind of like an empire. And the empire that's ruled by not only the faith and the teachings of Muhammad in the Quran, but also what that means for society, how society ought to be run, that faith and government are hand in hand, instead of sometimes in the West we have separation of church and state. In Islam, it doesn't make sense, and it's kind of it's against God to think that way in a sense. So that's kind of the birth of Islam. Then, as Muhammad, who was the first caliph of the Islamic Empire, when he passed away, I think it was his uncle succeeded him to the throne. When his uncle passed away, Muhammad's surviving followers, there was a fight over who would get to be boss. And so there was, I think the son of Ali was one of the guys, and then one of Muhammad's faithful followers was the other guy, and they both had their own supporters. And they're like, I should be boss. No, I should be boss. Well, the cousin got kicked out, and his followers, and so they fled to, I think, what's now known as Iraq, and they eventually caught up to him and his family and slaughtered him. So his the descendants that survived and his followers that survived, that's one of the differences and one of the start of the branch of Islam that's called, I think it's Shia Islam, which is Iran is famous for Shia Islam. And then those followers of Muhammad that weren't related by blood, they weren't part of his family, but followed his teachings, that's what's has since kind of grown and grown to become Sunni Islam.
Shiites are people who follow Shia Islam then? That's correct. Is Sharia law, is that Shia or is that everything Muslim?
I think it's both Shia and Sunni Islam.
Okay.
And there's different interpretations. And so when it comes to Sharia law is taking the teachings of the Quran and how do we build society based on that.
Okay.
And a lot of how that's determined, and really because the Quran, I'm only a little bit familiar with the Quran itself, but the Quran doesn't necessarily say this is how you ought to form governments, but they also have the sayings of Muhammad that were preserved, and of his followers that were preserved, how he spoke and how he behaved, how he ordered his government as he was growing his nation and his empire, how he appointed people, how he did justice, how he weighed different religions when he encountered them. And so a lot of these sayings of the Prophet and the sayings of the people that followed him, those are called, I forget what they're called. But in practice, at least I think certainly for Sunni and Shia Islam, but in practice, a lot of the day-to-day living and the practice of their religion is based on the sayings of Muhammad's followers more so than the Quran. In principle, the Quran is preeminent, but in practice, it's the hadith. That's what they're called, the hadith, which is Arabic for the sayings. So that's the different teachings. It's similar to the, in Judaism, they have the tradition of rabbis, like Jesus was a rabbi, which is like a teacher. Mm-hmm. And in Judaism, even before Jesus and certainly after Jesus, they have a lot of commentary and kind of arguments and wondering what's God like, what's his laws mean, how do we live, and how do we treat each other. That tradition that preceded Jesus mm-hmm. and that followed Jesus, and that Jesus was actually really a part of, Judaism has that kind of commentary on the Torah as well. And so that's a similarity that Islam has with Judaism, is that same type of, they have their holy text, then they have conversations around the text that's preserved through history. Mm-hmm. And how those different teachers had differences of opinion throughout hundreds of years later, those kind of form into different sects and different interpretations.